The gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, sending a flock of startled birds scattering across the endless Montana sky as Brock Farley's bullet found its mark in the weathered fence post. The year was 1879, and in the unforgiving landscape of Big Sky Country, a man's reputation was often all that stood between him and the grave. "Reckon that'll hold," Brock muttered to himself, holstering his Colt Peacemaker with practiced efficiency. The wooden post had been splitting, and the nail just wouldn't take. Sometimes lead was more persuasive than iron in these parts. At 32, Brock had the hard-set jaw and granite eyes of a man who'd seen too much of life's cruelties to believe in its mercies. The war had taken his youth, the frontier his family, and the bottle had nearly claimed what was left of his soul before he'd sworn it off 2 winters past. Now he rode for the Diamond Bar Ranch, kept to himself, and asked nothing of the world except to be left alone with his horses and his memories. His boss, Hank Donovan, had often remarked that Brock Farley was the finest horseman and most reliable hand he'd ever hired, and the most god-awful company a man could keep. Brock preferred it that way. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after Chickamauga, not after the Apache raids that had claimed his parents' homestead, and certainly not after finding his former partner stealing cattle with his own brand altered. He mounted his sorrel gelding, Storm, and clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward along the northern boundary of the Diamond Bar's grazing land. The Montana Territory stretched vast around him, spring grass beginning to green after a brutal winter. His breath still clouded in the morning chill as he rode, scanning the horizon with the vigilance that had kept him alive all these years. It was near noon when he spotted the overturned wagon in the distance, the broken wheel evident even from afar. Brock hesitated, his first instinct to avoid whatever trouble had befallen the traveler. It wasn't his concern. Then he saw a movement, a figure struggling with something beside the wagon, and against his better judgment, he turned Storm toward the scene. As he approached, he made out a woman in a dusty green traveling dress, her honey-blonde hair escaping from a once neat bun as she attempted to lift a heavy trunk from the wagon bed. Beside her stood a small bay horse, still in harness, looking as confused and distressed as its owner. "Need a hand, madam?" Brock called out, maintaining a respectful distance. In these parts, approaching strangers too quickly was a good way to find yourself staring down a shotgun barrel. The woman straightened, pushing loose strands of hair from her flushed face. She assessed him with wary green eyes. Smart, Brock thought, to be cautious before offering a tentative smile. "I would be most grateful, sir. The wheel gave out about an hour ago." Her voice carried a slight Eastern accent, cultured but not pretentious. "I was trying to lighten the load to see if I could manage some repairs." Brock dismounted, leading Storm forward. "Where you headed, madam?" "Timber Creek. I'm to be the new schoolteacher." She extended a gloved hand. "Grace Goodwin." He hesitated before briefly taking her hand. "Brock Farley. I ride for Diamond Bar. Timber Creek's still 15 miles northwest." Grace Goodwin nodded, her shoulders squaring with determination that seemed at odds with her delicate features. "Yes, I'm aware. I had hoped to arrive by nightfall." Brock surveyed the damage. The wheel wasn't just broken, the axle had cracked as well. "This wagon isn't going anywhere without extensive repairs, Miss Goodwin. Not something that can be fixed on the trail." A flash of distress crossed her face before she masked it with composure. "I see. What would you suggest, Mr. Farley?" The sensible thing would be to offer to ride to town for help, leaving her with some supplies. Getting personally involved would only complicate matters. But something in her steady gaze, the quiet courage there, made Brock hesitate. "Diamond Bar's only 4 miles east. We can secure your belongings here and return with a proper wagon tomorrow." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tonight, you can. There's accommodations for visitors at the main house." Grace studied him, perhaps weighing his trustworthiness against her limited options. "And Mr. Donovan wouldn't mind the imposition?" "Mrs. Donovan would have my hide if I left a lady stranded," Brock replied truthfully. Martha Donovan, the ranch owner's wife, was formidable in her hospitality. After a moment's consideration, Grace nodded. "Very well, Mr. Farley. I accept your kind offer." They worked together to secure her most valuable possessions, books, teaching materials, and personal items under an oilcloth tarp, weighing it down with rocks. Brock unhitched her horse and fashioned a lead rope. "You can ride Storm," he offered. "He's steady. I'll walk and lead your mare." Grace looked uncertain. "I wouldn't want to put you out. Perhaps we could alternate." Brock almost smiled at her consideration. "I've walked farther for less reason, Miss Goodwin. The saddle's yours." As they set out for the Diamond Bar, Brock found himself stealing glances at the schoolteacher perched somewhat awkwardly on his saddle. There was something about her, a quiet strength beneath the proper exterior, that caught his attention despite himself. She sat straight back despite what must have been an exhausting ordeal, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about the territory or commenting on the landscape with genuine appreciation. "Have you been in Montana Territory long, Mr. Farley?" she asked as they crested a small rise. "Long enough," he answered, then felt compelled to add, 8 years this summer. "And before that?" Brock's jaw tightened. "War. Then Texas. Then here." Grace seemed to sense his reluctance. "I've come from Boston myself. My father was a professor at Harvard, but after his passing last winter, I found I needed a change." "Timber Creek's quite a change from Boston," Brock observed. She smiled, a genuine expression that softened her features. "Yes, I expect it will be. But I've always believed that life reveals itself most clearly at the edges of our comfort." Brock made a non-committal sound. In his experience, the edges of comfort were usually just precipices to more pain, but he kept that thought to himself. They arrived at the Diamond Bar as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The ranch headquarters was a sprawling complex of log buildings surrounding a central courtyard. The main house stood 2 stories tall, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Hank Donovan had made his fortune in California before establishing one of Montana's most successful cattle operations. Martha Donovan emerged from the house before they'd even reached the hitching post, her ample figure moving with surprising speed across the yard. "Brock Farley, who have you brought us?" she called out, her tone simultaneously curious and welcoming. "Mrs. Donovan, this is Miss Grace Goodwin," Brock explained as he helped Grace down from the saddle. "The new schoolteacher for Timber Creek. Her wagon broke down about 4 miles west. Thought she might need a place to stay until we can fetch her belongings tomorrow." Martha's face lit up. "The schoolteacher? Why, we've all been wondering when you'd arrive. The children have been running wild since Mr. Pemberton left last fall." She took Grace's hands in her own. "You poor dear, what an ordeal. Come inside this instant. You must be famished and exhausted." Brock began leading the horses toward the stable. "I'll see to your mare, Miss Goodwin." "Thank you, Mr. Farley," Grace called after him. "For everything." He nodded without turning back, uncomfortable with gratitude he hadn't earned. In the barn, Brock methodically unsaddled Storm and tended to both horses, his mind unexpectedly full of the schoolteacher's green eyes and thoughtful observations. Foolishness, he told himself sternly. She was educated, refined, probably the daughter of wealthy Boston society. Once she settled in Timber Creek, their paths would rarely cross. Better that way. Hank Donovan found him there an hour later, leaning against a stall door and absently whittling a piece of pine. "Martha says you rescued our new schoolteacher," the rancher said, his weathered face crinkling with amusement. Brock pocketed his knife. "Just happened upon her wagon. Broken axle. Well, you're to join us for supper. Martha insists." Donovan held up a hand when Brock began to protest. "Don't bother arguing. You know how she gets." Brock did know. For all her genteel southern manners, Martha Donovan was as immovable as a mountain when her mind was set. "Yes, sir. And Farley," Donovan added as he turned to leave, "might consider washing up first. You smell like that ornery gelding of yours." Reluctantly, Brock made his way to the bunkhouse, where he kept a small private room as the ranch's foreman. He washed thoroughly, changed into his least worn shirt, and even attempted to tame his dark hair with a comb and water. The mirror reflected a face too weathered for his years, with a scar running along his left jawline, a parting gift from a Comanche brave in his Texas days. When he entered the main house, conversation was already flowing around the large oak dining table. In addition to the Donovans and Grace, the ranch's cook, Mrs. Peterson, and the Donovans' grown daughter Lillian, with her husband Thomas, were present. Grace sat in freshly borrowed clothes, one of Lillian's dresses. Brock guessed her hair neatly repinned, looking far more at ease than she had on the trail. "Ah, Here's our hero now, Martha announced as Brock awkwardly took the only remaining seat directly across from Grace. Hardly that, madam, he murmured, uncomfortable with the attention. Grace met his eyes. I disagree, Mr. Farley. Who knows how long I might have been stranded if not for your assistance. Just doing what anyone would, he replied, focusing intently on the serving platters being passed around. Not anyone, Hank Donovan corrected. Most men these days are too busy looking out for themselves. The conversation mercifully shifted to the upcoming cattle drive and local news. Brock ate quietly, responding when directly addressed, but otherwise content to observe. He couldn't help noticing how quickly Grace had charmed the Donovans with her intelligent conversation and genuine interest in ranch operations. She asked thoughtful questions about local families and the needs of the school children, clearly taking her upcoming responsibilities seriously. Tell me, Miss Goodwin, Lillian asked as dessert was being served. Whatever made a Boston lady choose Timber Creek of all places? We're hardly on the cultural map. Grace smiled. My mother was actually raised in Wyoming before meeting my father at a lecture he gave in Cheyenne. She always spoke fondly of her Western childhood, despite my father's efforts to transform her into a proper Bostonian. Her expression grew more wistful. After they both passed, I found myself drawn to the place that had shaped half my heritage. Well, we're mighty fortunate to have someone with your education taking an interest in our children, Martha said warmly. The schoolhouse needs work, Brock found himself saying, surprising even himself. Roof leaked something terrible this winter. Town council's been putting off repairs. Everyone turned to look at him, and he immediately regretted speaking. Grace, however, leaned forward with interest. Is it very bad? I was told accommodations would be ready. Brock shifted uncomfortably. Mayor Jensen tends to exaggerate the town's readiness. The building's sound, but needs attention before the summer rains. Perhaps you could advise me on what's needed most urgently? Grace suggested. I'm not afraid of a little work, but I admit construction isn't my area of expertise. Before he could formulate a polite refusal, Martha interjected enthusiastically. What a splendid idea. Brock is the finest carpenter in 3 counties. He built our entire North Addition himself. I couldn't impose, Grace began. Nonsense, Hank declared with the authority of a man accustomed to having the final word. Brock will escort you to town tomorrow with a proper wagon, help retrieve your belongings, and assess the schoolhouse. We can spare him for a few days to get things in order. He looked at Brock with an expression that brooked no argument. Right, Farley? Trapped. Brock nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. Later that evening, unable to sleep, Brock stepped onto the bunkhouse porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamond dust. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply and considering the unexpected turn his routine had taken. One broken wagon wheel, and suddenly he was committed to playing escort and handyman to the new schoolteacher. Beautiful night, came a soft voice from the darkness. Brock startled, then made out Grace's silhouette approaching from the direction of the main house. She wore a shawl over her borrowed dress, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her appear younger, less formal. Should you be out alone, Miss Goodwin? He asked, hastily extinguishing his cigarette. Probably not, she admitted, stopping a respectful distance away. But I've always loved the night sky, and it's so much clearer here than in Boston. She looked up, wonder evident in her expression even in the dim light. I couldn't resist. Brock followed her gaze upward. It is something special, he conceded. Mr. Farley, she said after a moment of companionable silence. I want to thank you properly for your assistance today, and to assure you that I understand Mr. Donovan volunteered your services without consultation. If you'd prefer not to help with the schoolhouse, I'm sure I can find alternatives. Her consideration caught him off guard. Most people took what they needed from him without a second thought. It's no trouble, he replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. The schoolhouse does need work, and the children deserve better than leaky roofs for their learning. Grace smiled, the moonlight catching the curve of her lips. You care about the children's education? Brock shifted uncomfortably. I care about things being done properly. A commendable philosophy. She wrapped her shawl tighter as a cool breeze swept across the yard. Well, I should return before Mrs. Donovan notices my absence and organizes a search party. Good night, Mr. Farley. Miss Goodwin, he acknowledged with a slight nod, watching as she made her way back to the main house, her figure gradually disappearing into the shadows. Brock remained on the porch long after she'd gone, troubled by the unfamiliar sensation in his chest, something like anticipation, though for what, he couldn't say. Morning came clear and bright. After an early breakfast, Brock prepared a sturdy wagon while Grace said her goodbyes to the Donovans, who had insisted she return for Sunday dinners whenever possible. Martha pressed a basket of provisions upon them, just in case, though Timber Creek was barely a 3-hour journey. As they set out, Grace beside him on the wagon seat, Brock found himself uncharacteristically searching for conversation. The trail can be rough in places, he warned. Creeks running high with the melt. Grace nodded, adjusting her bonnet against the morning sun. I trust your judgment, Mr. Farley. You clearly know this land well. Had to learn, he replied. Out here, not reading the land right gets you killed. Is that how you got that scar? She asked, then immediately looked apologetic. Forgive me. That was terribly forward. Brock unconsciously touched the mark on his jawline. Comanche raid in Texas. I was slow. He was faster. He rarely spoke of it, but something about her direct gaze made evasion seem pointless. You've seen a great deal of conflict, she observed, not with pity but a kind of quiet understanding that unsettled him. Too much, he acknowledged. War changes a man. My father said the same. He served with the Massachusetts Volunteers. Grace gazed at the distant mountains. He came home physically intact, but carried wounds no one could see. The simple statement, delivered without drama or expectation, cracked something in Brock's carefully maintained wall. The nightmares still come, he admitted, the words emerging before he could stop them. Less often now, but they still come. She nodded, not looking at him, giving him the dignity of his confession without scrutiny. Fathers did too, until the end. They fell silent then, but it was different from Brock's usual tense stillness. This was a silence of mutual recognition, an acknowledgement of shared understanding that required no further words. They reached the site of Grace's abandoned wagon by mid-morning. Everything remained undisturbed, and they worked efficiently to transfer her belongings to the Diamond Bar wagon. Brock was surprised by the practical nature of most of her possessions, books, certainly, but also tools, seed packets, preserved foodstuffs, and sturdy clothing better suited to frontier life than he'd expected from a Boston lady. My mother's influence, Grace explained when she caught him eyeing her canvas trousers and work boots. She insisted that true ladyhood had nothing to do with impractical clothing and everything to do with one's character. Brock found himself almost smiling. Sounds like a sensible woman. She was, Grace replied, a hint of sadness coloring her voice. I miss her wisdom daily. By noon they had salvaged everything of value and continued toward Timber Creek. The settlement had grown considerably in recent years, boasting a general store, livery stable, church, saloon, and various other businesses along its main street. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a modest one-room building with an adjacent small cabin that served as the teachers' quarters. Mayor Jensen met them as they pulled up, his portly figure hurrying from the direction of his hardware store. His welcoming smile faltered slightly at the sight of Brock. Miss Goodwin, welcome to Timber Creek at last. Jensen pumped Grace's hand enthusiastically. I see you've met our local talent. Brock recognized the thinly veiled disdain. Jensen had never forgiven him for publicly calling out the mayor's shady cattle dealing 3 years prior. Mr. Farley has been extraordinarily helpful, Grace replied with a firmness that suggested she'd caught the mayor's tone. My wagon broke down yesterday, and he not only ensured my safety, but has offered to assist with repairs to the schoolhouse. Jensen's smile became fixed. Repairs? Just a few minor issues, I assure you. Nothing urgent. Perhaps I could see for myself? Grace suggested pleasantly, but with unmistakable resolve. The mayor had no choice but to lead them to the schoolhouse. The exterior appeared sound enough, but upon entering, Brock immediately identified multiple problems. The leaking roof he'd mentioned, broken floorboards, windows that wouldn't close properly, and a stovepipe that looked dangerously compromised. This is unacceptable, Grace stated, her voice quiet but firm. These conditions are neither safe nor conducive to learning. Jensen sputtered excuses about limited town funds and the difficulty of finding skilled labor, all while shooting venomous glances at Brock. Mr. Donovan has generously offered Mr. Farley's services, Grace continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension. I suggest we take advantage of his expertise immediately. Now see here, Jensen began. Unless, Grace interrupted smoothly. You'd prefer I write to the territorial superintendent about the condition in which I found the school? I understand Governor Potts takes education quite seriously. Brock watched with grudging admiration as Jensen's bluster deflated. The schoolteacher might look delicate, but she clearly knew how to handle difficult men. Of course, Miss Goodwin, the mayor conceded. Whatever you need. The town will cover materials, naturally. Excellent. Mr. Farley can provide a list, I'm sure. She turned to Brock with a small, conspiratorial smile. Shall we examine the living quarters next? The teacher's cabin proved equally neglected, dusty, with a leaking roof and evidence of mice. Grace surveyed it without complaint, simply rolling up her sleeves and declaring they would start there. You can stay at the hotel until it's habitable, Jensen offered. Grace shook her head. That would deplete my savings too quickly. No, I'll manage here. Mr. Farley and I will begin immediately. After the mayor reluctantly departed, Brock turned to Grace with newfound respect. You handled Jensen like a seasoned cattle driver. She laughed, a bright sound in the dusty cabin. Boston society may seem refined, Mr. Farley, but it's as much a battlefield as any other. One simply uses words instead of weapons. They spent the remainder of the day cleaning the cabin, with Brock patching the worst of the roof leaks as a temporary measure. Grace worked tirelessly alongside him, showing no hesitation to tackle the grimiest tasks. By evening, the small space was at least clean, if still in need of substantial repairs. I should return to the Diamond Bar, Brock said as the light began to fade. I can be back tomorrow with proper materials. Grace paused from arranging her belongings. Will you stay for supper first? It's the least I can offer after your help today. Something in her expression hopeful, but not presuming made refusal impossible. That would be fine. She prepared a simple meal over the small stove, and they ate by lamplight at the cabin's wobbly table. The domesticity of the scene stirred uncomfortable feelings in Brock, memories of family meals before the war, before loss had hollowed him out and hardened what remained. Tell me about the children I'll be teaching, Grace requested, drawing him from his thoughts. Brock described the families he knew, the rancher's children, shopkeepers' offspring, and several orphans being raised by various community members. He found himself speaking more than he had in months, surprised by how much he actually knew about the local families despite his general avoidance of social connections. You pay attention, Grace observed. You notice people. He shrugged uncomfortably. Habit. Noticing details keeps you alive. It also makes you a more compassionate man than you perhaps wish to appear, she replied with gentle perception. Brock stood abruptly, needing distance from her unsettling insights. I should go? It'll be dark soon. Grace walked him to the door. Thank you again, Mr. Farley. I'll see you tomorrow. He nodded stiffly. I'll bring lumber for the floor and roofing material. Good night, then. She smiled, the lamplight warming her features. Safe journey. The ride back to Diamond Bar gave Brock too much time with his thoughts. The schoolteacher was disrupting the careful isolation he'd cultivated, drawing him into conversation, making him remember what it felt like to connect with another person. It was dangerous territory. People left. People died. People betrayed. These were the constants he'd built his life around. Yet the next morning found him loading the wagon with supplies and heading back to Timber Creek with a strange anticipation he refused to examine. Over the next 2 weeks, Brock fell into an unexpected routine. He would arrive at the schoolhouse early each morning, work alongside Grace until midday, break for the meal she insisted on preparing, then continue repairs until evening. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence. Other times, conversation flowed more easily than Brock would have believed possible. He learned about her childhood in Boston, her father's academic pursuits, her mother's quiet rebellion against societal constraints. In turn, and to his own surprise, he found himself sharing fragments of his past, his Pennsylvania upbringing, his reluctant enlistment in the Union Army at 18, the horrors of Chickamauga where he'd lost his brother, his aimless wandering afterward that eventually led him west. Why Montana? Grace asked one afternoon as they replaced rotted floorboards in the schoolhouse. Brock considered the question. Space, he finally answered. After the war, everything back east felt confined. Too many ghosts in too small a place. She nodded thoughtfully. And yet you've stayed with the Diamond Bar for years. Found some kind of peace. Not peace, he corrected. Purpose, maybe. Horses don't lie or disappoint. The land is what it is, harsh, but honest. And people. Her eyes met his across the partly finished floor. People are. He hesitated. Complicated. Yes, she agreed softly. We are. As repairs progressed, Brock became aware of subtle changes in their interactions. Grace's hand would occasionally brush his when passing tools. Their conversations extended into the evening hours, neither seeming eager to end the day. He found himself noticing details about her, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, her habit of humming softly while working, how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled genuinely. The town noticed too. Brock caught sideways glances and hushed conversations when they visited the general store for supplies. Jensen watched them with calculating eyes, and the local gossips seemed to have found fresh fodder in the unlikely partnership between the refined schoolteacher and the taciturn cowboy. People are talking, he warned Grace one evening as they sat on the newly repaired porch of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. People always talk, she replied unconcernedly. Does it bother you? It should have. His carefully constructed isolation was being compromised, yet he found himself answering truthfully. Not as much as it should. She smiled at that, her gaze remaining on the horizon. My father once told me that other people's opinions are like the weather. Acknowledge them if you must, prepare accordingly, but never let them dictate your journey. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, she agreed, though it took me years to appreciate his wisdom. After a moment, she added, he would have liked you, I think. The statement caught Brock off guard. A Harvard professor and a rough cowhand? Unlikely. You underestimate yourself, Mr. Farley. Grace turned to face him fully. My father valued integrity and intelligence above all else. You possess both in abundance. Her faith in him was unsettling, unearned. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment, don't I? Her voice was gentle but firm. These past weeks, I've watched you work with unfailing honesty and dedication. I've heard your thoughtful insights on everything from local politics to literature. I've seen your kindness to children and animals. She paused. I believe I know your character quite well, Brock. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. Something shifted in that moment, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. Before he could respond, a commotion from town drew their attention. Shouts and the sound of galloping horses broke the evening quiet. Stay here, Brock ordered, rising quickly and moving toward the road. He intercepted a young rider, the blacksmith's son, rushing toward the outlying farms. What's happening? Brock demanded. Cattle rustlers hit the Sullivan place, the boy exclaimed breathlessly. Killed Old Man Sullivan and his hand. Sheriffs gathering men to pursue them. Brock's body tensed with the familiar preparation for violence. How long ago? Just an hour or so. They're headed north through Blackwater Canyon. He turned to find Grace standing behind him, her face pale in the fading light. I need to go, he told her. The sheriff will need experienced riders. She nodded, fear evident in her eyes, but voice steady. Of course. Please be careful. He hesitated, suddenly aware of how much he wanted to return to her. The repairs are nearly complete. Just the finishing touches on the school roof. The repairs can wait, she interrupted firmly. You come back safely, Brock Farley. The concern in her voice, the undisguised emotion shook him. On impulse, he reached out and briefly touched her cheek. I will. The next hours were a blur of urgent preparation and hard riding. Sheriff Mills had assembled 15 men, Brock among them, to pursue the rustlers, a notorious gang that had been terrorizing ranches across the territory. They rode through the night, following tracks by moonlight, pushing their mounts to the limit. Near dawn, they caught up to the rustlers in a narrow pass. What followed was chaos, gunfire, shouting, the panicked lowing of stolen cattle. Brock found himself in the thick of it, his military experience taking over as he moved with calculated precision. He didn't see the shooter positioned on the ridge above until too late. The bullet tore into his left shoulder, the impact knocking him from his horse. As he fell, his head struck a rock, and darkness claimed him. Brock awoke to pain and the gentle touch of a cool cloth on his forehead. He struggled to focus, gradually making out Grace's worried face above him. "Don't move," she instructed softly. "The doctor says the bullet went clean through, but you lost a lot of blood." He realized he was in her cabin, lying on her bed. Confusion and disorientation made his thoughts sluggish. The rustlers, most captured or killed. 3 escaped. She continued, bathing his face. "You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days." 2 days. The information struggled to make sense through the fog of pain. "How did I get here?" "Sheriff Mills and his men brought you back yesterday morning. The doctor thought moving you to town might worsen your condition." Her voice wavered slightly. "You've been feverish. I was worried." The admission, the evident concern in her eyes pierced through Brock's defenses more effectively than any bullet. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. For what? Protecting the community. Grace shook her head, her hand stilling against his cheek. "You have nothing to apologize for. For causing you trouble. Worry." Her expression softened. "Caring about someone means accepting the worry that comes with it, Brock." The simple statement hung between them, an acknowledgement that something significant had developed during their weeks together. Brock felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Why what? Why care? About me?" The question emerged raw, honest in a way he hadn't allowed himself in years. Grace set aside the cloth and took his uninjured hand between both of hers. "Because beneath all your carefully constructed barriers, I see a man of extraordinary worth. A man who believes in nothing because he's lost too much to risk believing again." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "But I believe in you, Brock Farley. I believe in the man who fixes leaky roofs for children he pretends not to care about, who works from sunrise to sunset without complaint, who risks his life for neighbors when needed." Her words washed over him like spring rain on parched earth. How long had it been since anyone had truly seen him? Since anyone had believed in the man he could be rather than the harsh, broken shell he'd become? "I'm not worth your faith," he whispered. "That," she replied with gentle firmness, "is for me to decide." Over the following days, as Brock's strength gradually returned, something fundamental shifted between them. Grace tended his wound, brought him meals, read to him from her collection of books, and talked about her plans for the school. She never pushed him to discuss feelings or make declarations, yet her steady presence spoke volumes. By the time he was able to sit up comfortably, the schoolhouse repairs had been completed by volunteers from town, motivated partly by genuine goodwill and partly by the realization that the fierce loyalty of Brock Farley was not something to be taken lightly. "School starts next week," Grace mentioned as they sat together on the porch one evening, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. 23 children enrolled so far. "They're getting a fine teacher," Brock replied, meaning it sincerely. She smiled. "Thank you." After a pause, she added tentatively, "What will you do once you've recovered?" "Return to the Diamond Bar." The question had been weighing on Brock's mind. The thought of returning to his solitary existence, of seeing Grace only occasionally in town, created an ache deeper than his healing wound. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "Donovan offered me a breeding pair of Morgans last spring, suggested I might want to start my own operation someday." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Your own ranch. There's good land available north of town. Not large, but enough for a modest start." He hesitated, then added softly, "Might be nice to build something of my own after all these years." "I think that sounds wonderful," she replied, her voice warm with encouragement. Brock turned to face her directly, gathering his courage. It would be a hard life, especially at first. Long days, tight finances. Not what a Boston-educated lady might expect. Grace's expression grew serious as she understood his implication. "Are you asking if I would find such a life disappointing, Brock?" "I'm asking." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you might consider sharing such a life with me." The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. "I came west seeking purpose and a place to belong," Grace finally said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "I found both in this town and the school." She reached for his hand. "And in you." Brock entwined his fingers with hers, his heart pounding with a hope he'd long ago abandoned. Is that a yes? Her smile was radiant in the fading light. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Brock Farley stood beside Grace Goodwin before the Timber Creek Church, exchanging vows that once would have seemed impossible to him. The town turned out in force. The Donovans made the journey from Diamond Bar. The schoolchildren watched with wide eyes, and even Mayor Jensen offered grudging congratulations. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Brock marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The harsh cowboy who had believed in nothing had found everything in a woman who believed in him, and through her faith, had learned to believe again himself. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their newly built cabin on what would become the Farley Horse Ranch, Grace leaned into his embrace. Happy? He asked softly against her hair. Completely, she answered, turning in his arms to face him. And you? Brock looked at the woman who had broken through every barrier he'd erected, who had seen worth in him when he'd forgotten it existed, who had given him a future when he'd been living only in the past. I never thought I'd find peace, he admitted, or purpose beyond survival, or someone who could. He struggled to articulate the profound change she'd wrought in him. Grace touched his face gently. Someone who could see you? The real you? Yes. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. You gave me back belief, Grace. In possibility. In tomorrow. He smiled, a full, genuine expression that once had been foreign to his features, but now came more naturally. In love. We gave those things to each other, she corrected softly. And we'll keep giving them, every day. As the stars appeared above the Montana landscape that had once seemed merely a place of exile, but now felt truly like home, Brock held tight to the woman who had transformed his world. The path ahead would have challenges all worthwhile journeys did, but for the first time in more years than he could count, Brock Farley faced the future with hope rather than resignation, with love rather than loneliness, and with the profound certainty that some beliefs were worth the risk of pain. For in finding Grace, he had also found himself the man he was meant to be, the man who could love fiercely and be loved in return, the man who could build rather than merely survive. And that discovery was the greatest treasure of all.